Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome you here this evening on behalf of myself and Vice Chairman David Warburton. As always with these sessions, there's a lot of people here and we want to hear from as many people as possible, so we'll try and keep the proceedings on schedule. What I would say is, once we've heard from the speakers, if people from the floor want to speak, if they would just stand up and say who they are. The main reason behind that is we see so we know who we're speaking to and addressing, and also the fact that we do now record these sessions and they are put on the website, so that would be immensely helpful if you would do that. We've got 6 guest speakers tonight, and I can't wait to hear what they've got to say. Again, this evidence meeting, the impact on people, we often talk about the processes and machinery and mechanics of things, but people are ultimately behind this technology and will be affected by this technology. So I will allow them to introduce themselves and give their presentations before we then move into the second part of the meeting, which is to obviously take the questions and get the debate started. So we'll start with Paul.
Thank you. So it's an honor to go first. I hope that I don't disappoint and at least can set a low bar for the people who come beyond me to exceed. So let me introduce myself. I'm Paul Domjan. I'm the Global Head of Research Analytics and Data at Exotix Capital. A slightly unusual name for a specialist emerging market investment bank, going back to the days when emerging markets were called Exotix. We were briefly a partnership, but that didn't work as well from a branding perspective. So we've been looking a lot at blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies and the impact on people, but I'll talk, I think, about the impact on people in the developing world. But hopefully that sets up a structure that we can use throughout the evening to think about at what point do these technologies begin to impact people and solve problems for them. So if we think about the developing markets, developing economies throughout their history have leapfrogged many technologies. Whether that's going all the way back to the 18th century, going straight to rail and skipping canals, as the western half of the United States did when it was an emerging market, to the beginning of the end of the 20th century, when developing economies leapfrogged the developed markets by going directly to mobile technology and skipping landlines. And indeed, there's plenty of research that shows that the impact of mobile technology as a result was twice as big on the developing markets as it was on the developed markets. The reasons for that are relatively straightforward. When I got my first mobile phone, it saved the hassle of fumbling for change or going to a payphone. But the first time I used a mobile phone in India, the alternative would have been a 25-mile journey to speak to someone in person. So the impact on productivity is much greater. I would argue that we may be at the beginning of another episode of this type of technology leapfrogging, as emerging markets move straight to blockchain-based distributed ledger technologies to enable trust, as an alternative to weak domestic institutions and capital controls. In exactly the same way that the lack of widespread landline telecommunications gave that double the impact of mobile telephony in developed economies, we would expect to see a similarly disproportionate impact of blockchain and cryptocurrency technologies in the emerging markets. Now, in order to explore this, let me just say a word about technology adoption. So what drives the adoption of innovation? And there's plenty of theory about this, and I don't need to go far into the detail. But one useful framework is to think about at what point is the new technology good enough to capture customers from the existing technology. Now, there are 2 different parts of that then. How good is the new technology, and how good is the existing technology for the use case of those customers? And this applies to business model innovation, to new technologies, et cetera. So mobile telephony captured its first customers in areas where existing landline technology was the least good fit. For example, people working remotely, people traveling, people on sites, people in emerging markets. Similarly, satellite phones have never taken off because they're able to do one thing incredibly well, but that isn't quite big enough to justify a market. So we have to ask ourselves, where is that first point where the new technology is good enough? And I would argue that when we look at blockchain and cryptocurrency, many of the places where it will be good enough first to be a widely adopted technology are in the emerging world where indeed it could have a transformative role. Now, I come from a bank, so I have to say that plenty of financial research in the space of blockchain and cryptocurrencies have focused on the inscrutable question of the future path of Bitcoin prices. Meanwhile, a number of developed market central banks have assessed, and I would argue wrongfully dismissed, the potential role of cryptocurrencies in the financial system, on the basis of speed, reliability, energy, etc. Why do I say wrongfully? Because they're comparing those technologies to areas where the existing solutions work very, very well, not to areas where the existing solutions don't. In emerging economies, however, the existing economic and financial institutions are much weaker than those of the developed markets. As such, blockchain and technology and cryptocurrencies appear a much more compelling proposition in emerging and frontier economies than existing institutions relative to developed markets, and they could have a much bigger impact on people. Let's take an extreme example. So in 2014, as most of you probably know, protesters in Ukraine held up on live television signs with QR codes linked to their Bitcoin wallets to encourage people around the world to donate to support the Euromaidan protests that eventually overthrew the government of Viktor Yanukovych. Well, Bitcoin transactions are slow and expensive when compared to other payment systems. You know, if you're buying something in an off-license, for example, they were by far the most, and indeed probably the only, effective and secure way to move money from outside of Ukraine to the protesters in Independence Square in Kiev. The existing technology, it was definitely good enough compared to the existing technology. So we see 4 specific areas where these new blockchain and cryptocurrency technologies would offer a particularly attractive alternative in emerging markets. Those areas are: number 1, a clear and reliable record of ownership; number 2, a mechanism for contract enforcement, a reliable mechanism for contract enforcement; number 3, a means of exchange; and number 4, a store of value. The World Bank's Doing Business data shows that many emerging and frontier markets tend to have much weaker systems for registering property and enforcing property contracts than developed markets or some of the larger emerging markets. For example, if we look across the emerging market universe, countries like Bangladesh, Kenya, Argentina, Pakistan, Nigeria rank near the bottom of the World Bank's index for ease of registering property. So even if a blockchain-based property registration system is cumbersome, in this sort of country where you're comparing it to nothing, or to, you know, in many places in Africa there are no public property registers, it could be transformative. I don't know how many of you have been to Lagos, but opposite my office in Lagos, can you raise your hand if you've been to Lagos? So we have a great office in Lagos. It's one of my favorite cities. Opposite it is a piece of prime real estate that's empty, and it has a huge billboard that says, "This plot of land is not for sale." And the reason for that is there's no property register in Nigeria. So people try to sell empty buildings all the time because they can't prove they don't own them. It's the only way to show that your empty building is not for sale is to put a sign in front of it saying it's not for sale, to prevent someone from falsely selling your building. You know, the impact of a reliable blockchain-based registry system, even if it runs slowly, is tremendous in that sort of economy. Similarly, contract enforcements. Smart contracts could have a huge role to play in emerging and frontier markets. Let's consider the simple example of international trade. Right? You know, in many of these countries we have very sophisticated digitized ports in countries with very weak contract enforcement. I mean, the ability to have a smart contract related to payment that's triggered when a container comes into the port removes many layers, not only of bureaucracy and scope for corruption, but also of risk. You know, similarly in the case of property. You know, once we have the other reason why you have the sign is because people get defrauded all the time in buying property. If you have a smart contract where the actual transfer of funds is linked to some kind of registration of ownership, in the same way that our current system in Britain, in a rather, I would argue, quite cumbersome fashion, but does work after a fact, you could have a really transformative impact in countries where people are routinely defrauded in property transactions and very little recourse to address that. The same sorts of principles can be used for a whole range of financial derivatives, or even something as simple as renting an asset. So I think there are a whole range of areas where blockchain-based registers and smart contracts connected to them really could be transformative in the developing economies. Cryptocurrencies also have a role to play. Now, I don't know that they have quite as big a role, but I think they certainly have a role to play, particularly in countries where they enable transactions that would otherwise never have taken place. In countries with capital controls, highly volatile currencies and high inflation, governance problems, payments transaction costs, and volatile domestic currencies, the volatility of cryptocurrencies is in the worst case, no worse than what they already have, and can be an attractive hedge against their domestic currency. So I began working on this project when I was talking with, in the series of a week, ended up speaking to a Brazilian corporate a Zimbabwean broker, and an Argentine technology company, all of which were upset about Bitcoin prices rising. And I said to them, well, I thought everyone involved in Bitcoin was pleased that prices were rising. And they said, no, because we use this every day to make payments, because we do business in markets where we don't have an existing payments mechanism. So the fact that the price is volatile is causing us huge trouble, because we actually need to use this as a currency, because even though it's cumbersome, it takes time to clear, it's so much better than what we have today. Indeed, for that reason, it's unsurprising that Argentina, with, as we all know, a very long history of currency instability, currency convertibility issues, et cetera, comes third among emerging frontier markets after China and South Korea in terms of both the number of blockchain and cryptocurrency startups and the amount of money they've raised. Now, I can guarantee you that's not because Argentina has a technological edge. It's because they understand the use case incredibly well. Now, a similar example is an anecdote, right? The patent that counts cash in your cash machine was developed in Brazil, because Brazil has hyperinflation, so they had to count a lot more cash. And that, as a result, in order to develop it, in solving these problems, you have an emphasis that shows you know the use case. So this brings us to the second two promising areas for cryptocurrencies. As a means of exchange in circumstances where existing mechanisms of exchange break down, and as a store of value in countries where the existing national currency is not a credible store of value. From the perspective of someone who spends my life advising investors, at this stage these technologies probably raise more questions in the emerging markets than they answer, but they're exciting questions. And the answers to them, I think, will tell us a lot about the impact on people. First of all, will firms in the frontier seize the opportunity to develop these technologies in the same way that, for example, Safaricom in Kenya or WeCash in Bangladesh seized the opportunity for mobile and mobile money and produced outside returns and innovation? I think they could, and we need to look for where that's happening. Will they improve governance? Will governments say, actually, we're struggling with property registration. It's incredibly corrupt. Let's go straight to a blockchain-based system. We have some interesting case studies of that with fertilizer subsidies in Uganda, which we can talk about afterwards. Or will people say, actually, our existing institutions are weak, and in order to bypass them, we're going to use these technologies. So they could, in some countries, they'll reinforce governance and allow governments to develop governance more quickly. In other ways, they'll help people work around weak governance. If cryptocurrencies gain acceptance as a mean of exchange and a store of value, and indeed, some of the countries where the largest share of national wealth are in cryptocurrencies are in Africa, like Kenya, where we're talking single-digit percentages of GDP. If they gain acceptance as a means of exchange and a store of value, will this pose a threat to the growth and expansion of the deposit base of traditional banks? Or will traditional banks find a way of interfacing with a more flexible system? If they do undermine traditional banks, and there's a fascinating paper about this, by the way, by the Reserve Bank of Australia, this potentially constrains economic growth because it limits the role of banks to intermediate credit. So one of the questions is, there are all these positive benefits. If that undermines the banking system and credit intermediation begins to fall apart, or does that, on the other hand, create a risk for the private sector in these countries? The answer to all of these questions is almost certainly yes, but in different places. And the question that I'm working on, and I'm actually working on a book project on this at the moment, which is a lot of fun, is where will we find the firms that use these technologies to grow and change the lives of people in the developing countries? Where will we find the governments that use them to enhance institutional quality and creditworthiness? And where will we find the examples of best practice that then could be applied across the world? In the same way that today, much of what we do with our mobile phones are things that were first done in developing countries. For 15 years, we've been paying for things in Kenya with mobile technology. Most of us here have done it at most the last 2. It took the technology a long time to become good enough to replace what we had, but it was good enough for what they needed many years ago. I think we'll find the same thing with many blockchain and cryptocurrency applications. And I'd love to talk about it, so thank you.
No, thank you for that, Paul. And people as customers and consumers is obviously very important. Although I did get a little bit worried when you started talking about overthrowing governments.
Well, there goes their democracy.
Okay, we'll move on to our next speaker then.
Okay, so I am Liam Bell, and I'm the research lead in the Blockpass Identity Lab, which is our collaboration with Blockpass Identity Research, Advanced Cryptography and Blockchain. I have a team of PhD students who work on a variety of blockchain use cases in fields such as healthcare, construction, food and drink, and even educational accreditation. So we really have a wide range of experience there. For me, I think that one of the advantages that this type of system presents is that it allows us to, first of all, have the trust in the system, but also have trust but verify. So when you look at supply chains, and this is kind of how this feeds into people, when you look at supply chains, if we're tracking, for example, whiskey bottles, or like a passion of mine, what is stopping someone from emptying the bottle and replacing the human element? Now we do have systems such as chemical identifiers that can do that, but these are trust but verify situations. However, when you look at medical assets in the healthcare field, that's where you do have a chance, even in a trust but verify situation, to create a supply chain that makes a difference to the ordinary person, because you can, for example, capture infection control details. You can share information between companies that don't trust each other. So if you look at the big medical device manufacturers, people like Siemens, HP Enterprise, they don't trust each other. They don't want to share their business intelligence data, but using various privacy enhancing technologies, you can actually allow them to share that data, have this trust and governance framework that says this data is being accessed here as well, but also be able to keep that business intelligence data private from the other operators on the network. Well, that actually allows you to improve patient outcomes, it allows people to live longer, and it allows us to avoid a lot of the issues in cases such as the vaginal mesh situation and the situations where, for example, orthopedic implants with high metal content were poisoning people because they were absorbing into the bloodstream, but we didn't actually know everybody that had them because we didn't have that end-to-end supply chain traceability. Now that's one of my kind of interests, but there's also the identity aspect, which is a large part of the work that we do. Now, the thing about decentralised identities is that it allows you to actually have control over it, because at the moment, if you consider what makes up your identity, the people that control it are, well, the government, but also Facebook, people we don't trust, Facebook, Google, Amazon, they have all your personal data. But when we look at building a decentralised identity service like you see in Estonia, then you have this ability to say, for example, Facebook has accessed my data at this point for this reason, this is the employee that did so, or this is the company that did so on their behalf. And that allows you to have this audit trail that previously was not really credible, but now we can build these types of systems, and there are companies out there who are working on that type of system. So these are some of the advantages that blockchain gives us as a technology, is it allows us to, I guess, regain control of our data in a way that we haven't had access to in the worlds of large tech monopolies that have kind of run roughshod over us on that case. Now, the other aspect I wanted to get onto was removing intermediaries. Now, for me, I don't believe that we will ever remove the regulators, as some maximalists do. I think that the regulators will always have a role to play in these systems. So, for example, but what it allows you to do is bring them on into the network and give them full visibility, because there are fields which at the moment are not regulated, but which are of interest to the government, particularly in a post-Brexit world. So, for example, the quality of food supply regarding cattle, there isn't actually a full understanding of what beef goes into the market, what level of lameness we have in the herd. That stuff isn't available, but that's because at the moment there's nothing that can allow farmers to share that, because they don't want to share with other farmers, obviously, but they also don't want to share with vets. Now, vets actually want to stop having to go out and fix these problems, because I can give you this statistic: 30% of the cows in the UK herd at any moment are lame and unable to give milk. That's a problem. But if we have the ability to view that overall supply chain, we can then improve food security, which has a huge impact on the people, especially in the potential post-Brexit world that we're looking at. I guess the other point regarding intermediaries, though, is that there are areas that we could remove them. So it doesn't apply in the UK, but if we look in the US healthcare insurance system, there are plenty of intermediaries there that essentially exist to make their profit. But if you deal directly with the insurance agencies and you have a transparent view of what people have claimed for, then you have that ability to make the correct consumer choice and move to the insurance plan that fits you, rather than the insurance plan recommended to you by the huge variety of healthcare providers in the US. And no, that could well be a situation we have to look for here. But yeah, I think it could, I think it could have a huge impact on our daily lives because of the ability to truly have control over or access over our own data, because around the world that's kind of not something that you have control of. I mean, if you look at young people, they move into the world and they give away all this information because privacy policies are 100 pages deep, and you don't really understand what you're giving up. If you've got an audit log of how people are actually using your data, then that kind of takes out that 100-page privacy policy that I would assume nobody in this room has ever actually read. Certainly I never have, and that's coming from someone who researches privacy for a living. No, I think from our point of view as academics, we like to work to ideate these use cases, especially in the public sector world. So one of the works we're doing is on building safety management, and to me that's a huge slam dunk to the supply chain, because at the moment they're not great at keeping documentation, but actually they're also not great at keeping certifications, and there's an identity layer there of being able to prove that you are a certified site safety engineer and have that be immutable, fraud tolerant, and be able to be accessed by the regulators, because at the moment that just isn't actually how it works. Building sites, if you've ever been on one, they don't record that kind of stuff very well, and that's how we prevent issues. I don't like to use the example of Grenfell, but there are plenty of issues in the construction sector of work that's at the end being cost cut and completely different to the architectural diagram that was set out on. So I guess reconciling those two is another aspect where we can really make some kind of change in the public sector using the technology. I guess again I want to wrap up though by saying that the only way we're going to be able to make change is by getting that kind of buy-in, especially for people from the public sector. And I've worked, obviously I'm come from Scotland here, and I've worked with Scottish governments, Scottish councils, and I think that we need to get that them into this kind of academic sphere, to get them involved in projects through our innovation centres like Innovate UK, and actually get regulators, get the government involved in these types of bids, so that they can see the benefit that it gives to the people. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Liam. Interesting to hear from the academic point of view, supply chain regulations, food security, and of course, dipping your toe into a bit of Brexit there as well.
Well, as an academic, I normally try to avoid the B word, but in present company, I made an exception.
Well done, anyway. Thank you for that. Can we now move to Marcus O'Dare?
Yeah, that's me. 2 academics in a row. Apologies. So, yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm here to talk about the impact of blockchain technology on 2 groups of people. The first is those who work in the creative economy. I don't know how many of them there are in the room, but the other group is those who value the creative economy, whether for its aesthetic values, because you love music or art or literature, or computer games or architecture, or because of its political values. So people talk of the soft power of the creative industries, the value of Shakespeare or the Beatles to so-called brand Britain, whether we think of valuing the creative economy in terms of its social value, the link, for instance, between the arts and well-being, or the economic value of the sector, which contributes 92 billion a year to the UK economy. So the reason I'm interested in this sector is because I'm Associate Professor in Music and Innovation at Middlesex, up in Hendon, and I set up a research cluster there with some computer science colleagues looking at the impact of blockchain technology on the creative industries, and I'm a member also of the British Blockchain Association, and have done various pieces of work in this area, including a report a couple of years ago, which is open access if anyone wants to read it. I think most of it's still relevant. It's called Music on the Blockchain, foreword by Nick Mason of Pink Floyd. Also, there was a paper I did for the Blockchain Research Institute, which was set up by Don and Alec Tapscott. That came out last year. It's about, more broadly than music, it's about the management of intellectual property on blockchains. And if you'll forgive the plug, I'm kind of ahead of Paul. I've just finished a book on this.
Congratulations. I need to call it so you can come help.
It's not out yet, but it's about the effect of blockchain technology on the creative industries. So what I want to do this evening is just briefly to set out what blockchain technology can offer the creative economy, before making a few comments about barriers and risks and a few recommendations. I'm not going to go in detail about the problems that need to be fixed in the creative economy, but the headline, I suppose, is basically that this is a golden age for consumers. We all consume content at the swipe of a finger, but it's not a golden age for creators. I'll explain why afterwards, but for now, just take it as read. So the first opportunity for the creative industries is in relation to ownership. The internet has been fantastic at distributing creative content. It's less good, however, when it comes to ascribing attribution. So creators are not getting recognition for their creative works, whether that's a photo that floats free, if it's even the watermark is cropped out or whatever, whereas a musical track, that people can change the metadata and no one knows who made the track and so on. So people are not getting recognition for the creative works, and they're not even getting the remuneration as well. So blockchains can create an unbreakable link between artists and their work by inextricably linking a data file, such as a song or a film, to relevant metadata. Beyond that, the opportunity lies not only at the level of the individual work, but in moving from a situation in which copyright information is stored in discrete silos to a situation in which we have distributed, networked, aggregated view of who owns a given piece of creative content. At the moment, you have a situation where there is no single database, for instance, of song information in the world. There are lots of databases, none of them are complete, some of them conflict. So lo and behold, when you try and license a song, different things happen depending on which database you go to, and the creators don't get paid. And then finally, there is the possibility of automating the licensing of these work and the royalties for this work. So at the moment, it's very difficult to use creative content. I know this, I've just gone through the process of licensing film footage from archives, and you're passed from one archive to the next one. They don't even know, some people, who owns what IP. And if you let alone think of a YouTube video maker trying to work out if he or she can use a given track in his or her song, his or her video. People were willing to pay for this, but at the moment, money is being left on the table because there is so much friction in licensing. So the possibility here is an automation through smart contracts, and also in royalty payments through smart contracts. Or, I mean, personally, I prefer some other phrase than smart contracts, like programmable transactions, but let's go with smart contracts, since that's what everyone else seems to do. So at the moment, you consume, let's say, a song or a film immediately, and the people who made that song or that film may wait months or years to receive the royalty payments back, which is due to legacy systems that we now have the possibility to change. We have a situation in which we have to keep track of more usage data than ever in the creative industries, because we used to only have to track each purchase, whereas now we have to track each stream. So there's enormous need for micropayments. Tracking and technology that has low transaction fees is what we need. This is not to say the blockchains offer a silver bullet. There is the garbage in, garbage out problem, that somehow you have to get the right information on the database in the first place. There is a break in the train problem, which is similar to what Liam mentioned in terms of pouring the whiskey out of one bottle. You still have to somehow make sure that a painting, for instance, its tracking can be, its provenance can be passed on the blockchain. Somehow you have to link the actual painting back to the blockchain, otherwise you don't know what happens to the actual artwork. And since we're talking about the impact of blockchains on people, I should mention too that decentralized technologies do not necessarily decentralize power. So Don Tapscott calls blockchain technology the Internet 2.0. Well, Internet 1.0 began with dreams of decentralization, and look where we've ended up. But overall, there are significant opportunities for the creative industries in blockchain technology, but there are also significant barriers and even some risks, in the sense that just as the internet has been both good and bad for creators, blockchains too, as well as being used for the opportunities I've mentioned, could be used to create a distributed storage of works illegally in such a manner that notice and takedown procedures, which is the way in which infringing works are currently removed, are no longer effective. So there are concerns as well as opportunities. But whether we think of this as positive or negative, it does seem to me that the technology is potentially transformative, and that goes for the creative industries as well as fintech, whatever other vertical you want to name. And just to wrap up, I wanted to end with 7 headline policy recommendations. If you want the nuanced version, you have to buy the book. Headline things are: embed blockchain technology in industrial strategy in the creative industries sector deal, establish a cross-sector, cross-departmental blockchain working group, publish clearer guidance on the treatment of cryptocurrencies and tokens, extend the sandbox program to include tokens and industries beyond fintech, establish blockchain innovation hubs around the UK, invest in the blockchain talent pipeline through schools and universities, and finally take the lead in working towards global multi-stakeholder blockchain governance. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Marcus. And one possible first, which is mentioning the creative economy in quite that detail that we've had there. But I think a definite first to mention Pink Floyd. So thank you. We'll now move on to our fourth speaker, which is Elizabeth Renieris. If you'd like to tell us about your organisation, what you're doing.
Sure. Hi, my name is Elizabeth Renieris. I'm Global Policy Counsel at Everynym. Everynym is a startup that's building commercial products and services that enable a new form of identity management that we call self-sovereign identity, and a new relationship known as the new relationship, and I'll explain each in turn. But first, why am I here? A bit about myself. So I'm a US qualified lawyer, I'm a certified privacy professional in the US and Europe, and I'm also a policy consultant. I practice as a government attorney, in-house counsel at 2 tech startups, and outside counsel with 2 major global law firms. I've lived and worked in 5 countries on 3 continents and have quite a global cross-border perspective as a result. I'm also an active participant in the EU Commission's Blockchain Observatory and a contributor to their forthcoming paper on blockchain and GDPR. I was also in the same class as Mark Zuckerberg at uni, so I've been quite focused on data protection and privacy ever since, and undoing some of the wrongs that have been done there. For the last 3 years or so, I've been specifically focused on blockchain distributed ledger technologies, and the 2 are now converging or colliding depending on your perspective. So given my background, I see the tremendous opportunity for blockchain and related technologies to usher in a new way of interacting with others, but also, importantly, significant risks if we don't get it right. So at the outset, I want to say that blockchain alone will not change anything. It's merely a technology, a tool, a means to some end. But coupled with changing attitudes towards privacy and data protection, identity, and how we architect trust, notably, it has the potential to change our daily experiences. So with that caveat, I want to focus on one particular use case, which is the potential for blockchain-enabled self-sovereign identity to forge a new relationship that's like the old or offline real-world relationship, but digital, or more accurately, remote connections. So I'm using the word remote, not digital, because in the future, all of our interactions will be digital, because everything will be digitized. So the difference, therefore, is not whether you present a paper or digital credential. It's whether you trust in its verification by a person and person by human. So for example, comparing the visual scan of your face against the photo in your passport, or else remotely by a machine. So utilizing your biometrics and the blockchain to verify its validity. Put differently, it's whether there's a technical intermediary that you trust for verification purposes. In the case of blockchain, that technical intermediary is arguably more accessible, transparent, auditable, and with the proper design and governance, more trustworthy than the alternatives. The self-sovereign identity leverages these features of blockchain to radically restructure how we interact remotely. So in a nutshell, self-sovereign identity is a new paradigm for how we interact in the world on the basis of our digital information or our data. Rather than organizations controlling large centralized silos and data stores and mediating our access to services, self-sovereign identity puts the individual at the center of her data universe and enables private and secure peer-to-peer transactions and interactions between individuals, organizations, and also things. In the self-sovereign identity paradigm, there's an equalizing function as between individuals and entities, interacting as peers and requiring mutual authentication and trust. So rather than the one-way trust that we require in remote interactions today, not just requiring you to authenticate yourself to your bank, but your bank would also have to authenticate themselves to you. And if we succeed with self-sovereign identity, the result would be that our remote interactions would feel more like our proximate or face-to-face ones. In this way, it would be both new but also familiar at the same time. So yes, as set out in the guiding questions, we can say that the promise of blockchain, at least in part, is to blur the public-industry divide and to ensure peer-to-peer interactions with no intermediaries, while minimizing costs, ensuring trust, and bringing a sense of ownership, though I prefer the term control, to both individuals and organizations. But I want to caution that the promise of no intermediaries is overstated. In the case of self-sovereign identity, blockchain is effectively a technical intermediary that acts as an independent verification tool to mediate those remote interactions. For the time being, such technical intermediaries are of course controlled by individuals and organizations. And as long as we exist in something more than chip and processor form, as long as we're still more than our data, and as long as real-world inputs must be digitized, as we've mentioned, we cannot trust in technology alone. Ultimately, blockchain is an interim step towards fully remote peer-to-peer interactions, but we're not there yet. And along the way, we need to build trust and governance. Trust in the people and organizations behind these technical intermediaries, and governance in how they are designed and operated to protect our fundamental rights to privacy and data protection. If we don't get it right, blockchain could pose significant risks, such as creating an immutable record of events that could prejudice our rights in the future, reestablishing silos amongst incompatible ledgers, or creating a presumption against what isn't documented on a ledger, whatever good reasons there may be for such omissions. However, if we can meaningfully solve or engineer solutions for these issues in the design of our technology solutions, and perhaps more importantly in their governance, we stand a better chance of having a bigger impact on individuals. In summary, to the extent that blockchain can be leveraged to strike a new deal on data, to adjust the balance of power between individuals and corporates, and to make cross-border global coordination more efficient, it does have the potential to bring some critical paradigm shifts into reality. Self-sovereign identity leverages blockchain to radically restructure how we interact remotely, which could be both revolutionary and familiar, as I noted, resulting in remote interactions that mirror the ones we've known for time immemorial in the offline or analog world, but with better verification, less friction, and enhanced trust. If it succeeds, blockchain will be a mere back-end technology, silently and visibly enabling these changes in our day-to-day realities. That's how we know when blockchain works, when no one knows it's there. So when assessing blockchain-based technologies, the government should focus less on the technology and more on the relationships that we want to encourage and the society we want to live in. Think about what the technology could help enable rather than what the technology is today. And from the government's perspective, that might mean opportunities for enhanced civic participation and constituent or citizen engagement, even a chance to revive our democratic institutions. All the while, it is critical to examine the governance behind any implementations or use cases for these new technologies. Especially in respect of our personal data and privacy, blockchain can also pose grave risks if we don't get it right. This is why we need more conversations like this one, and I thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the dialogue, and I look forward to taking questions.
No, thank you. There's a great overview of some interactions there. Obviously, the question on everyone's lips, are you Facebook friends with Mark Zuckerberg?
I'm not on Facebook.
Maybe that's for another meeting.
Good choice.
I'm sure there's some interesting interaction. We now move on to our fifth speaker, Robert Schwertner. Robert,
Yes.
over to you.
Thank you very much, first of all, for the opportunity to speak. When we have heard now these talks on blockchain, I would like to bring it back to the social impact. That's where I want to be touched. That's where I want to see this technology being used. And I'm an enthusiast of blockchain since 4 years and into that matter deeply. But 2 months ago, I was on a conference, actually I moderated a conference in Bangkok, and there was a panelist from a central bank advisor. And he said, to Singapore Central Bank, and he said a very interesting thing. He said, what is the core of blockchain? The core of blockchain is that it reflects the social relations we have. When I talk to you now, I talk directly to you. There is no intermediary, there is no middleman who transponds, it's me. And I found this very touching, and I found this really, this is a bit different to the internet, where we have servers somewhere in countries. Blockchain does not know borders, does not know countries. It's a platform, it's not confined to frontiers and borders. So we have a new quality here, and this technology can enable that. As I was so active in this blockchain sphere, I realized there are lots of scams, fraud in this sphere. I invented kind of the hashtag Return on Society, ROS, Return on Society. I wanted to be part of projects which make sense to people, which have a growth potential, and it can be for refugees and groups which are have difficult situations, but it shall also reach the masses. This 99%. And for me, it's really hard in an exercise to reach out to the people, to my parents, to my neighbors, to my friends. How can this be achieved? And as this sphere is still dominated by IT experts, by cryptographers, we need more creatives, we need more stories, and that's where that's the direction I go. When I entered this blockchain sphere, it was really hard to understand what is a transaction. It's really like the internet. We use it now, but actually, do we really know how it works? And blockchain shall be the same. In terms of application, I try to find projects which make sense, which reach the masses. I'm on a fan project, it's a fan platform. They try sports fans, Ronaldinho support this and other famous players. It's to reach the masses. One can argue, and researchers maybe will find that this is not a pure blockchain case. But if we are too pure and focus on these 1% super pure cases, it will stay small. But I want projects which really reach the masses. Another project is, for instance, vault security. It's a kind of registry to register goods. Yeah, I want, it's for anti-theft, anti-crime. So an energy project, and here I come from the energy field. I managed for the Austrian government 10 years the City of Tomorrow program. It's a research program with an energy focus, but also was always our question, what's the social impact of research? And there we can learn from. What I try to do is to develop indicators. How is the social impact of a project? When we have heard wonderful cases, music, data protection, and what's the impact? How can we reach these people? How can we reach out? And finally, I would like to say, when we have a look at these cryptocurrencies which dominate the market, still in thinking, because obviously it's this greed, this hope. Yeah, I also developed this term BAAR, blockchain as a religion. We believe we will become rich, we will become famous. Yeah, it's a human, it's very natural, it's fine. I also want to be famous. I also want to maybe rich and have a good life. It's very legit, very, very rightful in a way. Why not? But governments, and that's where we could see what governments should do, and also parliaments in legislation. Giving the goals. What is the goal? To say clear which direction shall we go? I work a lot with Asian projects, and there they have the problem regulation. They are over-regulated. And we have other projects in Europe, we see they succeed. They have a better framework. So in the US it's also difficult. We have this so-called utility token where you can get a certain purpose, yeah? But these times are over. Utility token where you can have a purpose purchased with a token, it's over. What we have is now that we enter the security token, asset-backed tokens, where there's a value behind it. So we see a development. And there is a development in this blockchain, and also we must ensure that these goals reflect the development. It's not just if we talk here now, this will be in 2 months. No, maybe change it. So we must think that there will be changes. I work on I'm on board in 3 different blockchain projects of the 3rd generation, where Bitcoin 1st generation, the second is Ethereum, and this smart contracts. Turns out smart contracts are actually not very smart, they're not contract. I'm sure this is discussed often. The problem is it just runs through, you cannot stop. We have the 3rd generation, you have mutable, you can change smart contracts. Yeah, they're bi-directional. If I'm a customer, yeah, and I can also change something. It's not just running through. So it's a third generation. And as we know from the iPhone 3, yes, we have now iPhone 10 with blockchain number 3. Maybe one day have blockchain number 10. So this in consideration, this is all in flow. But what I see is the difference, and the core difference to what we have is this, and that's a wonderful part also, is this platform thinking in a way that all contribute to the good of all. Let me give you an example. Mobility platform. We have Uber now and other in place. They are threatened very much because this blockchain has the potential that then when I park my car somewhere in Austria, where I'm from by the way, Vienna, park somewhere and it's right next to the office, it's very convenient for me. But for the shop owners, these little shops there, they hate me because they want their parking lot free, that customers come. So what I do is good for me. With blockchain, we can incentivize. If my car would be rent out, let's assume everything's digitalized, you mentioned that let's assume this is, I could rent out my car to someone with a key, yeah? And actually there's a system in place, drive filters, there's another mobility programs. Let's assume this is possible. I would think, okay, if I get £100 a day pay for my car, just having another person riding it when it's there one day, I could think, okay, where's the best parking lot for my car? Maybe it's not in the front of the shop, maybe it's somewhere else, and this can be incentivized. And that's where I have this incentive. That's where the game theory, I have an incentive to do something. And that's a big difference to the internet. The internet is very one-dimensional. We do something, we give out our data, we get a nice platform, Facebook, Uber, and all. Blockchain is dynamic. And there are also developers profit from that. They can have new applications. Car owners, maybe and one platform, not just Uber, maybe we can just book the train and the metro, and so a multi-purpose platform. So that's also the direction I see. We will have a layer of internet, and then we will have a layer of blockchains. Now projects tend to make different, blockchains. I make my own internet, and I make also my own mobility internet, and we have 7 energy internets. And this will grow together, and maybe in the long run end up in one big system. And for that system, we need that vision. We need to have policies. We need to have goals. Which direction do we want to go? Because social innovation tells us not everything which is decentralized can stay decentralized. We must care for it, yeah? Like a nanny. We must let little child let it grow, and then it can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron, for that very energetic contribution. And I know there's a periodic story about Jedi being registered as a religion, but now blockchain might knock it off that perch before long. We now move to our final speaker of this evening, which is Sheli Gupta. If you would like to take us through your presentation, thank you.
Thanks, Damien. Thanks for everyone. And Gosha gets the credit, I think, of throwing me in the deepest deep end since we just announced European operations last week. This is actually our first public talk about humanity. Go to the slide. So this didn't come through that clearly. And actually, I'm probably starting with a little bit of the end in mind here, Damien, in terms of recommendations. If everyone can see that, I apologize, it's a little blurry, but if you look on the left-hand side, so intellectual property was actually started here in the UK, actually. I didn't know that myself, actually. The statute of monopolies was actually passed in 1623. And the middle one is actually the end of slavery. Actually, that reflects more in the US, and actually the end of slavery was in 1853 in the UK. And humanity really is based on establishing data as a property right. So a little bit about myself, and I'll tell you a little bit about the company. Studied here in the UK, and then pretty much have spent the last 30 years in the US. Started and sold a couple of software companies, primarily in the pharmaceutical industry. So have had a lot of familiarity with the amount of data, unbeknownst to most people, which is scary, that is actually sold in the healthcare industry, not only in the US, but here as well as across Europe and the rest of the world. And like I said, just came over here literally about a month ago to start up the Operations for Humanity. We are a very new startup in the US. We're only 5 months old. Europe was not supposed to happen until next year, but I was moving here anyway, and one thing led to another. I won't bore you with the story, but we are up and running here now. So Humanities, basically, the premise is everyone has the right to own their data, and that if somebody is buying and selling it, we should get paid for it. Sounds like a bold idea, and the reason you see the hashtag 31 there, if you're familiar with the 30 human rights that the United Nations passed in, I guess, 1948, they're claiming there should be a 31st human right, which is that our data should be our property. And we are blockchain based. We just announced a major partnership with IBM, so we're using the Hyperledger platform for that. And the idea is you would claim your right to your data through an app. So actually the app lab was literally just launched on Friday, so everything's happening very quickly. So I thought I'd share with you a couple of use cases that really would demonstrate the impact on people. We've actually, prior to the app even going out, we announced a partnership, a three-way partnership with the government of Liberia and a company called Imcon. So Imcon has a very interesting product. They have what's called an internet backpack. It's literally a backpack that is solar powered. You can drop it into any region, it connects via satellite, and you have pretty much instant internet connectivity. So what we're going to be doing in Liberia is we're going to be dropping these backpacks into hospitals and schools and clinics. And the population of Liberia is roughly just shy of 5 million. I think to Paul's point earlier, and he kept mentioning Kenya, and I was actually born in Nairobi, so I'm actually wondering maybe I should stay there with the opportunity that he's describing. But in Liberia, basically, the 31st human right is going to actually be embedded in those internet backpacks. So out the gate, every Liberian citizen, or educated, is actually going to have their right claimed out of the gate. So any data that is generated, bought or sold, we actually potentially have the ability, Damien, to actually change the GDP of that country by people actually getting paid, for transactions that are taking place. So we're not advocating that data should not be sold, because it is being sold today. It's something that's actually going to not go away, it's going to get worse. And we are going to expand out of Liberia into a number of other African countries, so Kenya being one of them, Uganda and Ghana, with a total target population of about 290 million. And I think to Paul's point earlier, the internet penetration for those 290 is between 4 and 8%. So it actually reinforces what Paul was saying, which is, they are very behind, but on the same basis, actually have the opportunity to actually leapfrog very quickly. The second use case actually with a company called Orb Health in the United States. They do chronic care management, so where there's patients who need treatment and can't get to somewhere or can't get to a doctor, they actually can interact remotely. And in that case as well, the Humanity app will be embedded in any interaction with that patient. And as they get treated, and as data gets sold, they will get compensated for it. I'd love to chat more about it, try to keep it short and sweet. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
No, thank you, and I think that's another angle that we've been looking at, intellectual property, something which is personal to someone, and their right over that. So that was interesting, and the fact that this has been happening since 1620, a little history lesson.
Exactly.
So we will move in now to the questions. So as I said before, for those at the back, if you could just stand up so the panel can hear the question. If you're making it to a particular individual, make it to that individual, and to the panel. Obviously, if your name, then you answer the question, and if not, don't feel as though you have to answer every question, because it is pertinent to what you're talking about, and also it takes a lot more time. If you feel as though you've got to say something, it's better to sort of get the shorter answers out there. David, I'll move to my Vice Chairman first of all.
Thanks, David. Thanks very much. That was 6 very, very interesting talks. I've got questions. I'm fascinated by establishing data as property rights, which is really the summation or could be described as a summation of all of this. I mean, with banks, with data and data protection, with the creative industries, there are already established service providers who are doing very, very well out of the current status quo, who are very successful and who are very profitable. And what I wonder is, what's their incentive to make what Elizabeth describes as the paradigm shift of behaviour? Speaking as chair of the all-party group for music and a former failed musician, I'm thinking, Marcus, you were talking about YouTube and Apple, content providers as they currently are. What would be their trigger to make the change whereby data was properly accounted for? Because at the moment they're pretty comfortable. So would it be a new provider coming in with these services, or do we expect them to make an entire mechanical behavioural shift?
Well, yeah, good question. I mean, as Elizabeth says, blockchain itself doesn't solve anything. People have got to use it. Definitely in terms of kind of big intermediaries in the creative industries, the initial response to blockchain was very resistant and sceptical because it was presented as radically disintermediating, and there'll be no one between the artist and the fan. Lo and behold, they didn't like that idea much. Some people have tried to do that, some startups have tried to do that, and they are operating, but we probably haven't heard of them because they're probably not working with household name type of artists. However, there are less radical, but perhaps more sort of practical projects that are being run. So there are startups that are working with major record labels. There's only 3 left, so there are startups working with them. There's startups working with some of the top 5 music publishers in the world. So they're using the technology because they want to reduce barriers to licensing creative works, or they want to reconcile data sets. So there are perhaps less radical use cases that could be more transformative.
So it's really new players coming to market and subverting rather than changing the behaviour of the existing
Yes.
clients. Sorry.
I mean, actually, sorry to interrupt, but in healthcare, so actually I'll give you a quote from Milan Kamkolkar, who's actually the chief data officer of Sanofi, major, obviously global French pharmaceutical company. And there is a status quo, you're absolutely bang on. They're buying, I think we valued the market for healthcare data at 50 billion annually. So that's what's being spent. And his statement to us was, with respect to people's personal medical data, he actually said, it is like blood diamonds in the world of data sharing. And his feeling was, and which has actually now become an advisor to our company, because he feels, if you can connect me to Damien instead of supposedly an anonymized patient record, and if Damien's willing to actually share data with me and get paid for it, they would far rather pay more and actually get data that could be used for more scientific reasons, etc. So there is a status quo that could be broken. I think there's going to be new players coming in, because if the people who are the incumbents don't change, I think they're going to face new competition very
So
quickly.
they're forced to change.
Yeah.
Can I add something to that? So I think that the way that you disrupt the status quo, the way that you achieve that paradigm shift, is you challenge the underlying assumptions that have created the situation in the first place. So one of my biggest concerns around data ownership is, having been a lawyer that's negotiated many of the contracts and many of the agreements where parties are negotiating ownership over data, if we accept the same assumptions, which are that data is owned and this data is contractually negotiated, we end up with the same situation that we have. So if we extend what we have, for example, in the ad tech world, to data at large, then we'll end up with the same broken model. So we need to challenge the fundamental assumptions. Now, from my perspective, data ownership is very dangerous. The reason that the GDPR doesn't talk about a data owner is because it's about fundamental rights. It's about civil rights, constitutional rights, human rights. It's about civil liberties. It's about control, and it's about all of the things that enable us to be us. And as our data becomes a proxy for us, it's even more important that we don't sell ourselves, right? So I think that there's a real risk in accepting the assumptions that have been fed to us by the big corporates, the big silos, the big platform providers, the ones that we mentioned that I know intimately, and unpacking those assumptions and challenging how we got here in the first place. If we don't, then they'll just co-opt all the new ideas that we're coming up with, and we'll implement them better and faster, and we'll end up with the same problems that we have now.
Anything else from anyone else?
Yes, there is one point in terms of when we talk about data protection, it's always all about that we give our data away. I like the 31st human right, by the way. My data, my own business. That's really nice. It's from my evidence. What the problem with the data is, on a business model approach, do we have a problem with data? We hear every day 50 million there, hacked, 100 million there. Really? Is this the problem? Is this a problem? I don't think so. But in the healthcare sector, and we have also a project out there, it could be very interesting to get new data. Liver cancer patients could sell their data and then make a profit, and not just doctors sell it. But people who are, so there is a chance to incentivize, but it must be done very carefully. It needs a lot of regulation, and it needs yes, especially when it comes to emerging market with less strict law enforcement.
I just have two sentences literally on this. You asked about how to disrupt the existing incumbents. Yeah. I would argue part of the answer is that we'll see these things happen first where there aren't existing incumbents. And that's part of why I'm saying a lot of this will happen first in emerging markets. The policy implication of that and the risk is that the existing incumbents here will try to encourage all of you as parliamentarians to erect barriers to Britain doing business with the new disruptors where there aren't existing incumbents. And I think part of the policy challenge will be if we reach a point in 5 years' time where some of these technologies are fundamental, for example, to how business is done in most of Africa, but here in Britain are still seen as somewhat marginal, are we going to shut those technologies out of our economy and thereby disadvantage the people who are using them to innovate elsewhere? So I think we need to be very conscious of the fact that oftentimes existing incumbents will be trying to prevent new innovators other places from accessing our market.
Yeah. So we've got work to do as politicians.
I think the thing that you find is that we're a blockchain startup farm trust, and we're trying to get into the healthcare sector. And so now that many of the incumbents are blocking their way.
Yeah. Is your point on this or a different one?
It's on a different.
Bring them to the end.
Some really great evidence and some great discussions, and it's fascinating to see sort of the different angles and themes. I suppose my question is around the business models today whereby data is valuable. If we are talking about disrupting those, doesn't data become invaluable? And therefore, so Facebook, your mate, he obviously makes a vast amount of money, as Google, Facebook, all the rest of them, because of our data is worth money. So what happens if the business model changes and we go to this very nice world of I own my data and I get paid for my data? Who's actually going to pay me? Because the whole ecosystem, which funds Facebook, etc., disappears. So it'd be great to just sort of hear views on how that could make happen.
I think one of the very cute things that happens when Facebook and others are, here in a regulatory environment or before a government, and they are asked about their free service. And I think we have to do away with this mythology of the free service. There are service models, and there are very traditional legal constructs we can use and business models we can use for services where they're valued, and we can attach a value to the service, and we know what the service is. I think this idea of there's a free service, but really, as you mentioned, we're making a very profitable business off of your data on the back end, is something that we can't persist with, because that's kind of the mythology we've all bought into. And that's where I go back to challenging the underlying assumptions. And absolutely agree with you that, if you take the data that has become, and I really don't like this analogy of the oil of the economy, and you devalue it, then there has to be a better business model. And there has to be a service being provided. It's a service that's meaningful and transparent that actually adds value to your life. So I think that's spot on.
You talk to how they get paid, because I probably didn't talk about that, but the new part of humanity is actually going to be a cryptocurrency. So you can choose to get paid in you all cash. And it's getting legs pretty quickly in the States in terms of what we're proposing. Again, for the reasons I mentioned earlier on, in terms of getting more accurate data and actually being able to get connected to the individual themselves.
Just sort of related to this, the one thing that slightly concerns me is I have these battles in my own head, is you've talked about there's areas which will take up change more quickly and that tends to be developed. And we see something similar in pharma in the 80s, where actually that becomes the playground or the experimental ground where these things are tried, and these things seem to be horrendously wrong. So I'm involved in a few projects in that kind of area. That's the ethics we face. What protections are you putting in place to make sure that all the trials out there aren't going to cause more harm? A good example is with Facebook again, Myanmar, and what's happened there. We will provide a free internet service to everyone who equates internet with Facebook, and all of a sudden the stuff happens. So I know this is a bit of a stretch from there, but when you consider using that as your place of first uptake, what are you going to do to stop that happening?
I know Gupta wants to make a comment on this as well.
So my comment on data here is that I actually one of these people who do think that data is oil. And the idea, of course, is that in the past technological revolutions, whether there's steel or oil or gas or coal, that has to flow as freely as possible and as much access as possible. It's simply the engine that actually are the groundbreaking for the emerging industries. And the issue with data here is the same. And if we start to put price on data really high, I do understand they need to be shared, it's incentive to share them. But if you put the price on data, this is the wrong direction to start the growth cycle. We need to make the price as low as possible, and we have business models that can actually get by in that way. The only times I've heard about data being to be paid is when we discussed unemployment and what are people going to be doing. But this is solving a totally different problem. The issue with data regulation, in my view, is that there's almost too much emphasis on ownership and too little emphasis on data use, and we need to move policy and regulation away from only focus on ownership to get encouragement for the use. And there we have a problem that as soon as it's used, we like this, and then we give people more ownership by, like, we have to accept all cookies, we have to opt in, opt out, we have to say yes, we can spend the full day deciding whether you should be, we can share your data here and there, or you'll help your family and children with what they can share. That's not the way forward. The way forward is we have some general regulation, we lift up the bar, there's so much data can be shared, there's no big issues in it, and then we can fuel the economy.
Any of the panel want to reply to that?
So I'd actually quite like to say something. Again, I hate using metaphors, but data is kind of the engine of our economy. But one thing I want to highlight is I don't personally see a world where Facebook is going to be giving you cash in hand for your data. I think much more likely, cash in hand or token in hand, whatever we want to call it. I think it's much more likely that what will happen is, if we are to move to this world, it'll kill off the free lunch that is Google and Facebook, and instead what you'll get as a reward for sharing your data is the use of that service. But it'll be much more transparent because you'll actually get the features that your data is worth, and therefore there'll be a transparent value chain created that doesn't exist right now. So I don't see, as a lot of some of the idealists see, people getting directly rewarded by Facebook or Google. I see them being rewarded in the service that they're already consuming for free, untransparently.
Anyone else on the panel want to?
Can I just build on that slightly? So, I mean, we're talking about personal data, but this transition has already happened many, many times in B2B data. So I can talk about it in finance. It used to be everything flowed through Bloomberg. They got it for free. They sold it. They made an enormous business. Now people say, actually, that transaction I did, it's still my data. I want to sell it here separately. You have alternative data brokers who support that. I'm sure Sheli, and I don't want to put you on the spot because I just met you, but I'm sure you can talk about the same thing in healthcare. The only difference between a B2B use case and a B2C use case is scale. If this transaction can happen in B2B where businesses take back ownership or take back the rights to benefit from and choose how to monetize their data, then those same models should be able to be applied to consumers if the interface is right and the scale problem is solved.
Again, not to hop on too much about the pharmaceutical industry, since I've certainly made a living in it. But I think the feedback that we've generally received from, won't name some of them, but there's pretty much some of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. There's a guilty feeling there. They know they're buying data. And I mean, I tell my friends that your prescription, and it's happening here as well, when you go and get a prescription, that prescription is being sold. They claim they removed your name, but your name is sitting there somewhere attached to that prescription. But they'll sell your age, they'll sell your general geography. It's then aggregated, and then the industry claims that, well, I don't really know who you are. But there's this, I think there's this underlying guilt. They do know what they're doing, and they're spending a ton of money doing it. So when you actually approach them with something different, say, look, here's a mechanism we propose that you could actually get more transparent. I think we talk about transparency and trust, and where you can absolutely guarantee that it is Damien. Then there's an openness to say, okay, let's look at it. So there are, where we're focusing on healthcare, obviously, is a massive industry that's pretty well entrenched. But so far, 5 months into it, we're getting fairly favorable responses. So.
Always good. Is it on this point or something else?
A question on privacy and data.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Okay, I'll bring you in. I'll go over here first.
Oh, sorry.
So I think that the question that I ask, since we're talking about data in the context of privacy in particular, where is the value is what I would ask. What specifically gives data the value that it has? And I would argue that it comes from the links, not the individual components of data, not the individual cells, not the individual transactions, but the links between transactions that gives data its value. And in as much as that's the case, the question that I would suggest that we ask, and I would ask to all of you who are dealing with data, is it unitary? When we're talking about individual persons, since this is what this particular evidence session is about, it's about people, are the data going to be unitary or not? I would argue that the value derives, in many cases, from it being unitary. And it does not need to reveal your name in order for it to be unitary. It can reveal metadata about you, such as your age, or whether you have a certain license or not. It can also reveal simply that you've transacted with the same identity more than once, and that those transactions are linked. And I would suggest that if it is unitary, and these systems rely upon fundamentally unitary qualities like biometrics, are these going to bind individual persons to an entire permanent record of their transactions, either held explicitly or implicitly by different parties who want to derive value from that permanent record? And if the answer is that that record exists, even if it is supposedly by a benign organization that supposedly doesn't have access to that record directly, the fact that that person has to go back to the same unitary identity that implicitly has those links that can be exposed in the future makes it value that has been transferred from the individual to other parties. So my question to you is, for those of you who are dealing with data that can be identified with individuals, does it have to be unitary? And if so, can you change that?
Who wants to answer that?
I can start. So I'm deeply concerned about the digital footprint of society. I think in 2010 or 11, Victor Meyer-Schomburg wrote a book called To Delete: The Importance of Forgetting in the Digital Age. This was before blockchain became sort of mainstream. I think with blockchain now there are heightened risks around that. I think what I mentioned before about a presumption against something that hasn't been recorded or isn't on a ledger, denying the existence of it, right? And so with something like data where there is a human right aspect, which is an intrinsic right, which doesn't need any outside documentation or extrinsic evidence, there's a significant risk to relying upon an immutable record in terms of anonymous data. And I think that the data protection regulations that we see emerging, particularly GDPR, but also ones that are trying to mimic it, are very conscious of the importance of data for legitimate purposes like research and scientific purposes, historical records, where the data is aggregated and anonymized. The use cases you described with a specific individual where the data, of course, it's personal data that's still tied to that individual and stored in the immutable ledger, of course, are the ones that we're most concerned about. And that is where the vast majority of blockchain projects now, I think, are finally recognizing that you would never store any kind of personal data on any kind of ledger. That said, we don't have perfect solutions right now for where you would store that data and how you completely decouple and delink that data from any correlatable kind of record around an individual, which is why I think that we have to be, again, very mindful around governance of this technology and cannot trust in a technological solution, particularly where there's a path dependency that it can't be reversed. So I think that you have to look for the projects that are engineering. This is something that we do at Everynym, we call policy engineering, engineering the law and policy into the design of the technology, so that we can be sure. And of course, that's still not a perfect science, but it's something where if that isn't even part of the design of the product engineering, then you're already starting from a sort of faulty proposition. But it's a big concern, and I do very much recommend that people read the book To Lead in light of the blockchain ecosystem that's emerging.
So is it unitary?
Well, I mean, it depends whether the data is fungible or not. So it's not term in law, but certainly there's pseudonymous data, right? There are degrees to which the data is still correlatable.
So then, yes.
Okay, and we've got 4 people and also to ask questions, so we can try and keep all of the answers as succinct as possible and be brief.
One point to the unitary. Yeah. Yes and no. I think it's yes, because every crime is linked to identity. So there is no crime not linked to identity. It's always linked to identity. So data need to be protected, but it's unitary, so that it's important, this part. But no, because I'm also an actor, profession. So I have a lot of identities. I'm also father, I'm writer, I'm singer. I want many identities. And when we touch the people, we can have just one big set of data. That's you. No, I'm more than that.
Okay, so
Yes, you and then, yeah.
Was it me?
Yes.
Okay, so I want to ask this question. We have been working with security and privacy for a very long time, and with the blockchain, there are some problems. I assume that issue about privacy, anonymization, and making things uncorrelated is possible, and cryptographically is possible. I don't know whether we have the ability to do that, but assume that everything is okay and the technology works fantastically, which is a big assumption, but I don't want to dispute that. Ultimately, the business model of decentralizing data makes the assumption that the consumer, we know what we are doing, and ultimately apply to us, the panel, and this is a strong assumption, who is going to educate the public, and who is the responsibility for educating the public? Because in my experience about privacy, whether just with the blockchain or not, educating the public who has to take the decision, it is very hard. So I really would like to know, out of this business model, how do you see the education of the public who ultimately needs to either sell or not sell this data, and probably also decide the price?
So, yeah, if you come and make a point, then I'll go. And
I'd like to ask how much work's being done on the definition definition of what is personal and what is private, because to me that's a fundamental issue, because a lot of people, totally agree with the gentleman over there about the use of the data, and aggregating the data is where all the value is. And to me it just comes back to protecting the individual by defining what is personal and what is private to me. And if by giving up some information it can be traced back that it is me and reasonably identifiable, then that's personal and private. But if you can't reasonably identifiable that it is me from a list, then why is there an issue? And we should be aggregating that data as quick as possible. So has enough work been done here by the regulators and the policy makers on defining what is personal and what is private?
So if the panel that are answering that, if they could do it in 30 seconds and answer both points, I'd be immensely grateful.
Also, the first question.
But we'll leave.
Okay, so the first question, I think the answer to that, and obviously I say this as an academic, from an academic institution, part of the role that we have in society, aside from educating people through traditional degrees and through research, actually part of our role is educating society as a whole and being involved in that process. But I also think there is a role in the education of the value of data for government and for the consumer regulation aspect of it, which of course we can then enforce the companies to then do. Because of course they're not going to do it if we don't incentivize them to do it. And you can either have the carrot or you can have the stick of regulation. And I think that in the case of data brokerage, and data markets, if we're going to be encouraging people to sell their own data, we have to tell them what that actual value is, rather than deceiving them in a way that says, you know, that it's worth less than it is. Yeah.
Anyone else on the panel?
I'm a private, so it's a false dichotomy. There's no such thing as private data law. So personal data is can be something that's widely known, your address, your date of birth, your name, but it still needs to be protected in the way that it's used. So the law is not looking at whether something's widely known or not. There are degrees of something that you might consider secret, right? Something that only you know or that you've shared with a couple of other people, that you've disclosed to a wide array of people, and there's a spectrum there. But in terms of something that's private, that's not a useful distinction in law. The useful distinction is who have I shared that information with, what have I authorized them to do with it, how have they shared it, and have they exceeded the scope of that authorization, and what's the impact on my rights? So I think we need to move away from this notion of public and private, and we need to think about the impact of the data, because the same data used in a different context has a very different impact from the data used, you know, amongst in a personal relationship.
Just to let you know, I have very few minutes left. I've got two questions that I want to bring in, so I'll bring the gentleman here first. And if you'd like to answer.
Sure, yeah, I'm going to be very quick. My name is Alan Zahira, ex-PwC, just left, and I was helping companies in the blockchain community in ICO. I raised some significant amount of money for my clients. And as of now, working as a CFO, company who raised several hundred million in ICU. So my question is, I think we broadly we're talking about big data already. I think everything is really stable, and I can see that the data it's increased from 1 zettabytes to 6 zettabytes only in 5 years, and now it's expected to be 50 zettabytes by 2025. So it's a huge issue. I understand that the blockchain, that's what we're discussing, that could probably solve the problem, and MICE and GDPR and all that stuff. The biggest challenge that I can see in the market at the moment is really the cost of building anything on blockchain. People just cannot afford it. Even the larger organization tried to do something, they couldn't afford it. So that's one side. The second side, of course, the use case. Is the market really ready to adopt blockchain technology as it is, including the cost, including the other new ways of working and stuff? So it's really, that is my big question.
And again, the challenge for me is if you can do it for 30 seconds. 3 minutes. Anyone want to take that?
I'll take a very quick version of it. So it certainly is ready in places where the cost is already even higher, because what exists there is so poor.
Well answered. Lady at the back.
I might stand up just so I can talk to everyone. My name is Catherine. I'm from Outlier Ventures, which is a VC that invests in blockchain and DLT. We are investing in Everynym, so I am quite biased. But I'm going to stir the pot a little bit with my question. It kind of develops on the data protection, kind of building Web3 angle. So we invest in what we see as building Web3. So we see data silos which will lead to AI monopolies. And my question is more, how do we protect people from these data monopolies and AI monopolies? Because if we imagine an ideal future, and if we imagine a very negative future, the question to the panel is, what do those look like? What does this kind of FANG monopoly future look like? And what does a very democratic data future look like? And how can we actually skew that using blockchain? So thank you very much.
So you've got a very good.
Yes. First of all, we don't know, to be honest. We don't know how it looks like. But at least AI needs to have a limited by law or so. There needs specific laws, regulations for AI too.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am going to have to bring the meeting to a conclusion. I would like to thank all of you for attending another very well attended session, very interesting. But I think it remains to us to just thank our guest speakers tonight.